Verse 5. Very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God without being born of water and the Spirit. What does he mean by that? Now, I have to tell you, over the generations, people have understood this expression, born of water and the Spirit, in a number of ways. Some people think it means natural birth plus some kind of spiritual birth. Born of water maybe is the breaking of the water when you're born, before you actually begin to push out. It's natural. Versus born of the Spirit, something from God, supernatural. So there are two births. You have to be born of water and of the Spirit. I don't think that's what it means. Partly because I have not been able to find anywhere in the ancient world that people spoke of natural birth as being born of water. That just wasn't an expression that anybody used. Moreover, if you compare verse 3 very carefully with verse 5, you'll discover something about this. Verse 3, very truly I tell you. Verse 5, very truly I tell you. You see, the two sentences are parallel. Verse 3, no one can see the kingdom of God. Verse 5, no one can enter the kingdom of God. So it's souped up a bit more from see to enter, but you're still in the same sort of sweep. Verse 3, without being born again. Verse 5, without being born of water and the Spirit. In other words, born again is parallel to born of water and the Spirit. Born of water and the Spirit isn't signaling two births. First, birth 1, born of water, then birth 2, the born again part. No, the whole expression, born of water and the Spirit, is parallel to born again. So what does John mean by that? What does Jesus mean by that? There's one other small hint that we can pick up before we conclude what it means. Down in verses 9 and 10, when Jesus has given his answer, Nicodemus still doesn't quite understand it. He says, how can these things be? And Jesus replies, you're Israel's teacher? You're the teacher of Israel, probably a title, the Grand Mufti, the Regius Professor of Divinity, and you don't understand these things? Now, what things should Nicodemus, because he was the Grand Mufti, the theological senior professor in the land, what things should he have understood? Well, what he should have understood, of course, was anything that comes from what we call the Old Testament, the first two-thirds of the Bible that we scanned last week. So the question becomes, where does that Bible talk about new birth? And the short answer is, it doesn't. But interestingly enough, in quite a few places, it does talk about water and Spirit. In other words, when Jesus says the birth I'm talking about is of water and Spirit, he expects Nicodemus to pick up that sort of language. Because after all, he's the sort of chap that has actually memorized the whole Old Testament. He knows the text that well. So he picks up. He should pick up what Jesus means when he talks about water and Spirit. There are a number of passages, but perhaps one of the most striking is found in an Old Testament prophet by the name of Ezekiel, writing about the 6th century. In chapter 36 of Ezekiel, God promises a time when he will make a new covenant with his people. You will recall last week we noticed how God writes his own agreements, his own covenants. He has one, for example, with Abraham. And then when the law is given with Moses, that's a kind of covenant as well, an agreement. And then when he begins to use David as the founding of a whole dynastic order, it's a Davidic covenant, an agreement that God has arranged. But now Ezekiel is promising a new covenant. And he says that in this new covenant, he says, I will sprinkle your hearts with clean water, indicating cleaning somebody up morally. And I will pour out my Spirit upon you, indicating life and power from God himself. So whatever else this birth is, it's the promise of a prophet from 6 centuries earlier, bound up with the dawning of a new covenant, a new agreement from God, that would be characterized by moral transformation, the water sprinkling the heart, and by the power and life of God to transform and renew. That's what Jesus means by the new birth.